We're getting ready to start. Yesterday, we learned about a shaila as to what's considered an avoida for the purposes of pigul. We learned about pigul, that pigul means during one of the four major avoida classes, which is shchita, kabbalah, halacha, and zrika. You had kabbalah during one of those four avoidas to do an achila out of the right time, and achila is defined as either Zrikas Hadam, Zrikas Shirayim, Haktaris or Imurim, or the Achila, thank you so much, or the Achila of the meat of the carbon Chutz L'Zmanoi. The Gemara wanted to know, by Chadas Pnimi, there's a little knech in the Zrika, where before the Zrika is done, the Kohen has to dip his finger into the dam of the carbon. The Gemara wanted to know, is that considered one of the avodas where if you had a machshava pigel there, it would passel. The Gemara ended up with a shaila, with the machlokes, of whether or not that's considered an avodah. And the real shaila is, what is the makar to all the other karbonis besides shlomim of pigel? But the main sukkim of pigel, where the Torah teaches us about pigel, is by shlomim. And the question is there another limit to include all other karbonis, and therefore whatever's an avodah in those karbonis will be subject to the problem of pigel, or is it all learned out of shlomim, and then you'd have to learn that it's a much broader limit from shlomim, just that whatever is an avodah for that particular carbon would make it susceptible to pigel. So by shlomim, it might not be the dipping of the finger in the blood, because that's not an avodah by shlomim, but it is an avodah by chatzah pnimi. And the same thing is lagabi, what would make a psul in the carbon that would then take away the psul of pigel. So by shlomim, it wouldn't be shechting shaloi l'shema, because shechting shaloi l'shema v'aya shlomim is kosher. It might mean shechting with a kavana of chutz l'mkoymai, but by achatos, even a kavana of shaloi l'shema would passel it, and therefore retroactively would undo a pigel, because we know pigel is only going to be pigel if there is no other psul in the carbon. And that took us to the top of Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, about 8 lines on the top. Rab Shimon Machshir B'Hillel, and the Mishnah told us that Rab Shimon held that Holacha is not considered an avodah for the purposes of a bad kavanah. Our Mishnah was talking about the kavanah of Shaloi L'Shma. The kavanah of Shaloi L'Shma wouldn't passel by Holacha, and the reason is because Holacha isn't an avodah that's always necessary. Because if the shechita occurred right near the mizbeach, Holacha wouldn't be necessary. So Amar Rab Shimon ben Lakish. Zok Reish Lakish. Moide Rab Shimon agrees by lachas chatois hapnimiyos shemachsheva poishalos behu. Although Rab Shimon said that halacha is an avodah that's not necessarily required, because you could shecht right near the mizbeach, that only applies to a carbon whose dam you spritz on the mizbeach achitzai. However, if you're talking about achadas apnimi, where the dam has to be brought into the heichal to spritz on the mizbeach apnimi, you don't shecht the animal inside the heichal. Rashi says lav oirich ara, to shecht the animal in the heichal. So the shechita will be in the azara, and it would be impossible to accomplish the zrika without a halacha of bringing the blood from the azara into the heichal to the mizbeach apnimi. So therefore, Rab Shimon is moide by lochas chatoit apnimi yosha machshava poiselos behu hoyel va'avoida shein yochel avatla. Their halacha is unavoidable, and therefore it's a major avoida and machshava of shaloi l'shema would possible. Correct the Gemara of Rab Shimon. Rab Shimon taught us another halacha, and that is kol she'enoi al mizbech achitzon kishlomim. Any carbon that the dam is not spritzed on the mizbech achitzon, like a shlomim is, which is the makar of the halacha pigel, ein chayov nalav mishum pigel. You're not chayav mishum pigel. And the Gemara wants to say, and therefore, by extension, there shouldn't be any problem of a machshava of shaloi lishma either. So how could you say that holacha would be considered an avodah for the purposes of machshava shaloi lishma if any carbon that requires mizbeach hapnimi wouldn't be susceptible to pigul anyway? Rabbi Yosef Reb Chanina moida haya live soil mikal v'chaim. Reb Shimon would be moida that it would be possible because of a kal v'chaim. Let's have a look at the Gimel. Moida. Rabbi Yosef Chanina moida who lives soil. So Rabbi Yosef Chanina says moida who lives soil. Reb Shimon would be moida that it's possible mikal v'chomer because of a kal v'chomer. Now let's hear the kal v'chomer. And Rashi says very clearly, Nihid ein behen pigel lischayiv kares. Even though Reb Shimon maintains that there would be no chayiv kares on such a carbon, that means if you have a chatas apnimi and you had a machshava of pigel, it would not mamish make it into pigol lischayiv kares ala chilosoi avol moidahu the machshava chut lezmanoi poslosim mekal v'chomer. Reb Shimon is moida that the carbon is possible. It just doesn't have the severity of pigol where eating that meat becomes is a chiyuv kares. But from a kal v'chomer he learns that it will be possible. Zokt Rashi, really the Gemara could have said that our Rish Lakish is talking about a machshava of shaloi l'shema. So you can't ask me a kasha from what Reb Shimon said about pigol. V'achanami of a motzal trusei lei anan b'machshava shaloi l'shema coming in the apostle. Elo the boy Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina lashmina the machshavas chutz l'zman the apostle Reb Shimon. But Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina wanted to say, as a matter of fact, that not only would a tzul shaloi l'shema impact such a carbon, even a machshava of chutz l'zmanoi would also impact the carbon, although it wouldn't be pigel with a chi of kares to meat, but it would still be possible. And why do we know it's possible? Mikal v'chomer. And what is the kal v'chomer? Uma shaloi l'shman, madach shaloi l'shma, shehuchseru b'shlamim, which is kosher by a shlamim, as we learned, a shlamim that was shechted shaloi l'shma is kosher. Nevertheless, possible b'chatos. It's possible by a chatas. We know a chatas is one of the karbonos that if you shechted with the wrong kavanah, the carbon is possible. So chutz l'zmanoi, pigel of chutz l'zmanoi, shepoisel b'shlamim, which would possible b'shlamim. Surely, ein din sheyivsel b'chatois. For sure, it should possible by a chatas. So therefore, in fact, the machshava will impact it. That Reb Shimon says it doesn't have pigel, it means there won't be a chi of course for eating the meat. Okay, so we found a makar that a pigol machshava of chutz l'zmanoi will passel a carbon, even a chatas hapanimi. But chutz l'mkoimai, how about a machshava of chutz l'mkoimai minalon? How do you know that that would also passel a chatas hapanimi? Zogt Gemara, imi chutz l'zmanoi. If you want to learn it from chutz l'zmanoi with a mematzinu, well, then I could ask mala chutz l'zmanoi shekein chares. Chutz l'zmanoi, you know what chutz l'zmanoi passels a carbon chatos apnimi? That's because chutz l'zmanoi normally, not by a chatos apnimi, but normally by other carbonos would create a chi of kares. So chutz l'zmanoi is much more severe. And mishaloi l'shmoi, and if you want to learn it from shaloi l'shmoi, just like shaloi l'shmoi passels a chatos apnimi, so too chutz l'mkoimeh should do the same thing. I would say no, because mal shaloi l'shmoi shekein noyeg babama. It's possible in abamas yochid during this man heter abamas. If someone was makir of a carbon on a bama ketana, a personal bama, and he had kavana to the wrong carbon, of course it would passel. So we're talking about a chatash l'shma. So whatever it is, it would passel. Meaning the psul of shaloi l'shma would have an impact by a bama, but the psul of chutz l'mkoimai would never have an impact on the carbon that's brought on the bama. You know why? Because if it's brought on the bama, by definition, anywhere is its mekaymai. If a carbon will be brought on the bama ktano, there is no restriction as to where you can eat it, and therefore there wouldn't be a problem of chuslam kaymai. So once again, just because I know that a carbon that was shekl shaloi l'shma would be possible, how would I, by extension, say the same thing would apply to a carbon with a kavan of chuslam kaymai when there's a great chumrah by shaloi l'shma over chuslam kaymai, and that's because shaloi l'shma will be a problem by an animal that was shechted on a bama, while the chuslam kaymai can't be a problem there. Zok to Gemara, that's not a kasha, that's not an upshot. Because shaloi l'shma b'may noiheg. Where would shaloi l'shma ever be a problem? It's not a problem by a shlomin, it's kosher by a shlomin. So where would shaloi l'shma pass the carbon? Only in two cases. B'pesach v'chatos. Those are the only two carbonos, which is where we want to learn it from. So we want to learn, just like a machshava of shaloi l'shma apostles, such as pesach and chatos, so too a machshava of shaloi l'shma of chutlam kaymai will pass. But where is that? That's only by pesach and chatos. Guess what? Pesach v'chatos bebama loy karvu. You were never allowed to be makir a chatos on the bama. You were never allowed to be makir a carbon pesach on the bama. So therefore, you can't say mal shaloi l'shma, which is a psul that would have an impact on the bama, because the karbanos that are possible by shaloi l'shma could never happen on a bama. So therefore, I could make a limud just like shaloi l'shma apostles. So too, a machshava chutlam kaymai will passel, and that's how we would know even by a chadus hapnimi. Rabbi Shimon holds that a machshava of shaloi shmoi and a machshava of chutlam kaymai will pass. Or we can just say hekeshu. There is a hekesh that tells us that edom kaymai, the chutlam kaymai will also pass. Why? It's from the following hekesh. Now let's look at the pasuk. So I'm going to slide over into the Torah Shalom Ois Beis. Bim he achel yeachel mipsar zevach shalomov. Bayoyim ashlishi. So bayoyim ashlishi zechutz lizmanoi. That in the pasuk of Pigel is referring to a machshava of chutz lizmanoi, because bayoyim ashlishi you had kavanah to eat it on the third day. But then the pasuk goes on and says, "Lo yiratza hamakriv loy lo yichashav loy pigol yiyeh." That's extra. So pigol yiyeh, that's referring to chutzlam kaymai. So in this pasuk of pigol, the machshava of chutzlam zmanoi and the machshava of chutzlam kaymai are there side by side. That creates hekesh. Therefore, once I know through a kal v'chaymer that chutzlam zmanoi will passel, so too I'll apply that same halacha to chutlam kaymai. So now we've confirmed that although there's no din pigel by a chatos hapnimi, that just means there's no din pigel to make an iser achila with a chiyuv chorus does not apply to chatos hapnimi. But avada a chatos hapnimi will be possible with a machshava of shalom shmai. A chatos hapnimi will become possible with a machshava of chutlam kaymai and chutlam. So now we're going to build upon what we learned. And we learned that Reb Shimon holds whenever a halacha is completely not necessary, where it's redundant, there the halacha wouldn't passel. So we built from there that if it's a carbon that you have to make this rika on the mizbeach hachitzayin, there halacha, any bad kavana during the halacha would not have any impact. Because technically you don't need halacha, you could shecht it right near the mizbeach. We also learned that if it's a chatas hapnimi, where halacha is inevitable, because you'd have to transfer the blood from the azara into the heichel to spritz it on the mizbeach hapnimi, their halacha is a irreplaceable avodah. It's required, therefore the machshava will pass. So now we're going to get into the nitty gritty of different types of karbanos and different types of shitas where some type of halacha is needed or not. So Amar Rava, im timtza loymar Rab Shimon savar lo kibarei. If Rab Shimon holds like Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon, what does Rabbi Elazar bar Shimon say? He says the Amar beina ulam mizbeach tzafay. So let's imagine in our minds what the floor plan of the Beis Hamikdash look? So I'm going to look on the board, and I'm going to imagine that I have an Azara, and there's the Ezras Yisrael, and to the left of it is going to be the Heichal, the Kodesh and the Kodesh Kedoshim, and then behind the Kodesh and Kodesh Kedoshim, all the way to the left, will be the rear wall of the Heichal, which will be the Maravi, and behind that is the Koshel Maravi that we have. So going from left to right, I have my Koshel Maravi, the Koshel of Harbais. Then further to the east, I have the Koshel of the Heichal. Then if I go more to the east, I'll have the front entrance of the Heichal, and then moving more to the east, I have some blank space in the Azara. Moving more to the east, I hit the Mizbeach. So there's the Mizbeach, which is furthest to the east. Moving along from the Mizbeach to the west, I hit a gap, a strip that's called Beina Ulam Ulam Mizbeach, the space between the Ulam and the Mizbeach. Then I hit the Ulam and the Heichal, moving towards the west. Now, we know the certain kabbalas have to be shechted on the north side of the Mizbeach. What does the north side of the Mizbeach mean? Does it literally mean on the north side of the Mizbeach? That's one thing that could mean, but it could also mean Bein Ulam Ulam Mizbeach, between the Ulam and the Mizbeach, which is really to the west of the Mizbeach, but the northern part of the west side of the Mizbeach. So what does Tzafoina mean? Where do you have to shech the carbon? You have to shech it on top of the Mizbeach, meaning to the north of the Mizbeach, or can you shech it to the east, to the west of the Mizbeach? That means between the Mizbeach and the Heichal, but in the northern half. So Zog to Gemara, in Tim Tzalomi Rab Shimon Savala Kabarei, the Amar Bein Ulam Ulam Mizbeach Tzafoin, that even shechting between the Ulam and the Mizbeach would be called Tzafoin. So then technically I could shech the Chadas HaPnimi right up against the wall of the Heichal, right there, up against the wall of the Heichal, and that would be considered Tzafoina. Because it doesn't have to be literally on the north side of the Mizbeach. It could even be on the west side of the Mizbeach, but on the northern half of that west side. So then, ein machshava moy elas by lachais hachatois hapnimiyos. Then, since I could check the carbon right up against the entrance to the ulam, I don't need to carry the dam across the azora. I don't need to make holacha. I do need to carry it into the ulam and then into the heichal. So there, that part of the holacha is necessary. So therefore, the only part of the holacha where there would be a possibility to have a bad machshava that would passel it is only mi pesach ulam ulafnim. Only the part of the halacha that's from the entrance of the ulam and inside. Because anything on the floor of the azara is not necessary, because you could have shechted it right there at the entrance to the ulam. Vim tim saloimar, savarla Rabbi Yehuda. And if you also want to compound that with the shita of Rabbi Yehuda, the Yamar Toich Azara Miktosh, Rabbi Yehuda held that anywhere in the Azara between the Mizbeach and the Heichal, anywhere in that spot, even on the floor, has the Kedusha of the Mizbeach. So therefore you could shecht it, and you would be able to make Zrika even right there on the floor. So then, Ein Machshava Moy Elas by Lochas Siluk Pozichen El Mipesach Heichal. So now we're going to switch gears, and we're no longer talking about Chatois Apnimiyos. We're now talking about the Lechem Aponim. The Lechem Aponim was like a carbon mincha, and it had an avoida that was parallel to the Zrika that's matir the Lechem Aponim to be eaten. There were Shnei Baziche Levoina that were placed on the Shulchan. And before the Kaihanim were allowed to eat the Lechem Aponim, the Baziche Levoina had to be burnt on the Mizbeach. So we're going to look at the hakrovas of the bazichin as if they are the halachas hadam. Now the question is, does it need halach? So if the floor of the azara in between the mizbeach and the ulam is just like the top of the mizbeach, then the bezichin levoina that are on the shulchan, I could technically place the shulchan right up against the front wall of the heichal, and then I just walk with the Bezich Levana just till I get into the Azara and put him down right there. So therefore, Vim Tim Tzaloimer, Savala Rabbi Yehuda, the Yomar Toich Azara is Mikdash, has the halacha of the Mizbeach, then Ein Machshava Moy Elas by Locha Siluk Bezichen Elami Pesach Heichal Uluchutz. Therefore, the halacha is not considered a halacha, because if you would have placed the shulchan right up against the front entrance of the heichal, I wouldn't need to carry it through the heichal. I wouldn't need to carry it outside the heichal, because once it's in the azara right there, I could be makriv the levina on the floor. But what has to be traversed is from the door of the heichal and through the ulam onto the floor of the azara. So therefore, the only halacha that's qualified to become a problem if you had a bad machshava was el mipesach heichal uluchutz, from the door of the heichal towards the entrance through the ulam up until the floor of the azar. But it gets better. Bimtim saloymar savar kedushas heichal v'ulam chadahi. If you hold the ulam, which was the area at the entrance to the heichal, if you hold that ulam also as kedushas heichal, so then walking through the ulam is not halacha either, because technically the shulchan could have been placed all the way at the front of the ulam up against the entrance. So then ein machshava me'elas al mepasach ulam lechutz. Now the ulam itself, the wall of the ulam itself, was 5 amos thick. It was a huge thick wall, which means the doorway that you walk through was almost like a tunnel that was 5 amos long, because you're walking through the thickness of the wall. So you know where you would need halacha? From the edge of the ulam, from the front of the ulam, you'd have to walk through that 5 amma tunnel, that doorway is not considered part of the ulam. So you would have to traverse that doorway to get it from the ulam into the azara, so that you could be makter the levina. So that halacha, which is inevitable, that halacha would be able to become possible through a machshava. Okay, gewaltig. But if you hold even inside of the doorway has the kedusha of the heichal, technically the shulchan could have been placed in that doorway right up against the border of the azara, and then all you'd have to do is take the bezichin off and reach down on the floor and be makar of them over there. So therefore, ein machshava me'elas afilu psia achas. You don't even need to take one step, because if the bezichin were on the shulchan that was right up against the front entrance of the ulam, all you got to do is take the bezichim and just bring them right down to the floor and put the levoina on the floor of the azara, which is a place where you could be makter them. So therefore, the only halacha is bichdei hoishatas yodai. Not even a step. The mere movement of taking the bezichin off the shulchan and bringing them down to the floor, that's the only necessary movement, and that would be considered a halacha. And if he had a machshava psula during that little action, that would possible, but anywhere else would pass. And that goes even further. We're going to have a shayla on the base. Does halacha mean you literally have to take a step with it? Or how about if I don't take any step at all, I just move my hand? I'm anchored in place, but I just take it from one area and move it over to a different area, and maybe that's not called halacha at all. If you hold that's not even called halacha, then ein machshava me'elas klal. Then if you held that the kedushas ha'heichal was all the way up to the front of the ulam, and you could be makriv right on the floor of the azara, there would be no opportunity for a halacha to have a machshava to passel by lechem upon him at all. So it's just an interesting combination of shitas that would lead to making halacha not required. And that's Reb Shimon shita. If a zrika or the equivalent of a zrika, like being makter to levina, can be accomplished without any halacha at all, that any halacha that you do because you decide to put them the shulchan further in, and you decide to bring it right to the mizbech, that all that halacha you could do, but it's not necessary. That would not be a halacha where a machshava psula would pass. Amar le Abaye la moired Reb Chisda. Abaye said to the mitargun of Reb Chisda, the rabbanim, when they would darshan in the olden days, they wouldn't have such a loud voice, so they would say it in an undertone to their announcer, and their announcer would act as their PA system, and the announcer would say it over loud so everyone could hear. So Abaye once spoke to the Amoyre of Reb Chisda, to this announcer of Reb Chisda, because that was a way to get close to Reb Chisda himself, and he told him, "Do me a favor, ask Reb Chisda a shaila. I'm curious to know what he would say with this shaila." Reb Chisda, Holacha bezor mahu. What if the holacha was done? Since we're saying that maybe you don't always need a holacha, when holacha is required and holacha is done, does it have to be done by a kohen, or could it be done by a Yisrael? Now, since holacha is not like an always required avoda, does it have the din of an avoda, lagabi the fact that a zor cannot do it? That was the shaila that he had. So Zok to Gemara, Amar Lei. So Reb Chisda answered, Ksheira, it's kosher. Halacha bezar is ksheira. Umikra misayeni, and I have a raya from a pasuk that a zar can do halacha, because it says in the pasuk, "Vayishchadu es haPesach," and "Vayishchadu es haPesach" means that Yisrael shech the Pesach. You don't need to be a kohen to shech the Pesach. So you shech the Pesach. Vayizruku haKohanim es hadom miyadom, and the Kohanim took the hands from who? Took the blood from the hands of the sheichtim. The Levim avshitim, and the Levim would skin the animal. So let's visualize what happened over here. A Yisrael shechted the carpet. Who made the Kabbalah? For sure, a Kohen, because Kabbalah is only kosher if it's done by a Kohen. So now the Kohen did Kabbalah. But the pasuk says that the Kohanim who did this Rika took the blood from the sheichtim. How did the sheichtim get the blood? It must be that after the Kohanim did the Kabbalah, they handed the blood back to the sheichtim, and then the sheichtim made the halacha and brought it to the mizbeach and handed it over to the Kohanim to do this Rika. So you see clearly in this pasuk that Zorim, Yisraelim, did this Rika. So he has a raya, Yisraelim did the halacha. So you have a raya that a Zor can do the halacha. Masav Rav Sheshes. Frek Rav Sheshes Akasha, you cannot say that. Because the Brisa says Zor over Oinen. So a Zor is a Yisrael. Oinen is somebody who lost one of the seven close relatives that day. So an Oinen is not allowed to do avodah. And Shikr, Rashi learns Shikr is somebody who's a Shasuya Yayin. Tosfos learns maybe it's not Yayin, maybe it's another mashka. Ubalmum or a Balmum, the Kabbalah by Halacha Bizrika, for any one of these three halacha, avoidus, Kabbalah, Halacha, Bizrika, puzzle will be puzzle. So how could you say, Reb Chisda, that halacha is ksher bizarre? The Brisa says these three avoidus, Halacha, Bizrika, and Kabbalah, may not be done by a zar. V'chein Yosy, so too, if it's a kohen, but he's sitting down, he cannot do any of these avodas. V'chein smoil, or with your left hand, you're not allowed to do any of these avodas. Zogt Gemara Tiyufta. So this seems to slug up Reb Chisda. Reb Chisda said that halacha could be done bizarre. This is a brisa that's pretty much clear that a zar may not do halacha. Freit the Gemara, Reb Chisda kraka Omar. Didn't Reb Chisda bring a pasuk to illustrate that it was the sheichtim who did the halacha? Zogt Gemara, not necessarily. Yes, the Kohanim, after they did the Kabbalah, handed the kalim with the blood to the Yisraelim. True, but they didn't do a halacha, because all they did was they reached over and handed it to the Kohen. Or no, they didn't even do that. They were just sitting it and holding it in their laps. They were acting as a stool, as a table, nothing more. And then the Kohen took it from them. So Zogt Gemara, in the pasuk, all they did is the Ovid Maisa Itztava. They didn't do anything. They were just sitting there, and they were literally acting merely as a stand to hold the blood. But they didn't make halacha. Zokt Rashi, Maisa Itztava, Oimdim B'Mkaiman. The Yisraelim didn't move with the blood. Oimdim B'Mkaiman Hazar Eitzel HaKoyim HaMakabel. The Kohen was Makabel Adam. The Zor was merely standing there. And the Kohen hands the container of blood to the Zor, and he just holds on to it, but he doesn't do anything with it. He doesn't make a halacha. And the Kohen Zor took it out of the Yid's hand. So the Zor was merely acting as a stand. The Zor did not take this dam and bring it closer to the Mizbeach. He didn't walk with it, but he didn't even stretch out his hand to pass it over to the Kohen. No, he just held it straight, and the Kohen took it from him. So he never engaged in any halacha whatsoever. He's no different than a little stand. So therefore, you can't bring me a raya from that pasuk that a zor could do halacha. There was no halacha, because a zor in fact may not do a halacha. Zok the heilige Gemara weiter. Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef Damri Tarvayu. Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef both agree. Halacha bezor is a machloikis Rab Shimon v'Rabbanan. It's actually a machloikis. Rab Shimon, the Omar avoida she'ef shelavatla lav avoidahi. He would hold ksher bezor. Rab Shimon holds that an avoida that's not always necessary is not considered an avoida, and therefore a machshava psula wouldn't passel. The same way a machshava psula wouldn't passel, so too if it's done with a zor, it wouldn't be a problem. But l'Rabbana, who holds that a machshava would passel by halacha, whether the halacha is required or not, psula clearly it's an avoida, and therefore if it's done by a zor, it would be possible. Amar Abaye, Zokt Abaye, v'hashchita, you're telling me that what is a litmus test as to whether something's an avoida, if it's ksher b'zor or not? Well, based on that, the litmus test that it's a zor could do, avoida cannot be done by a zor, and if we know that something is an avoida, then by definition we say a zor can't do it. I'll prove you wrong, because v'shchita, the avoida she'ev shelavatla, the shchita is an avoida that it's inevitable. Every carbon needs a shchita, yet uksher b'zor. So you see, whether or not you could be mevatel the avoida cannot be a litmus test as to whether something is considered an avoida, because shchita is an avoida. You can't be mevatel it, but we know for sure that a yisrael can shech. Omar lei. So Rabbi and Rabbi Yosy answered back to Abaye, shchita lav avoida hi. Shchita is not an avoida. Shchita is not an avoida. Are you telling me shchita is not an avoida? And Rashi says, mida ashkeru ba kol apsulim, since any posel kohen or a Yisrael can do shchita, it's clearly not an avoida. Of midi the hava avoida, the yev shelavatla posel b'zah. So you need now two things. A, it has to be an avoida, and B, it has to be yev shelavatla. That's where it's posel by a zor. Shchita might not be yev shelavatla, but shchita is not an avoida. Zakamar v'loy, you tell me shchita is not an avoida. The Amar Abzeira Amarav, shchitas para bizar psula. The para duma has to only be shechted by a kohen. There's psukim for it. If it can only be shechted by a kohen, it must be an avoida. Why else? Why else wouldn't a Yisrael be able to shech the para duma? If not, because of the fact that it's an avoida. So you see, shchita is an avoida. Zakta Gemara, v'yomar Rav Allah, and Rav said about it. Let's see what the Allah says. V'yomar Rav Papa Allah. Alazar v'chuka ksivba. It happens to say in the parasha of Paraduma, there's two words there that tell us that it has to be dafka from a kohen. It says zois chukas HaTorah, which tells me that it's something that is mevatel. It's something that would possibly if you don't follow. And it says at the end of the pasuk, unesatem oisa el azar akoyin, v'hoitzi oisa el mechutz al machne v'shachet oisa lefanav. So the choik, there's a choik that the para aduma has to be shechted by a kohen. So it's for sure an avodah. Zot no, it's not, because shiny para the koche bedek abaisi. First of all, the para is not even a carbon. So the whole concept of avodah is not irrelevant when we are discussing a paraduma. Fact the Gemara, okay, but I can make a kavachomer. V'lav kol dechenu, it's a kavachomer. Madach koche bedek abayis. Have avodah koche mizbeach lav avodah. Madach even for koche bedek abayis shchita is an avodah and it has to be done tafka through a kohen. So surely by a carbon, by kedusha guf, shchita is an avodah. Yet you see, it's ksher bizarre. Amar Abshisha Barei Ravidi. Midi the Hava Maris Nagoyim. You're bringing me a raya from the fact that the shechita by the par aduma has to be done through a kohen. It must be that it's an avodah. Absolutely not. There's many things that only a kohen could do, but are not necessarily avodas. For instance, who could look at a mara nega to say it's tamei or tar? Not a Yisrael, only a kohen could do. So Midi the Hava Maris Nagoyim. The lav avodah. No one's going to argue and claim that looking at Nagoyim is an avodah. No. But nevertheless, the Torah teaches us that it requires kahuna. So too, there's a shechita by the Parah Aduma, by Bebek Abayis, that there's a Gzeres Akasav that says that it has to be done through a kohen, but that doesn't prove anything about the fact that it's an avodah. So therefore, shechita is ksher bizarre because it's not an avodah. Even though the shechita is an inevitable action, it has to be done, but it doesn't have the status of an avodah to say that it's possible bizarre. Frank the Gemara. Very Holacha evorim lekevesh, the avodah she'efsher levatli. After they butcher the animal, the pieces of the animal need to be brought to the ramp to go up onto the mizbeach. Now that is not a necessary avodah, because the butchering could have been done right there at the mizbeach. So you wouldn't have had to bring the evorim to the mizbeach. So that's an avodah that you could have been mevatel. Upsula bizarre, and it's still possible bizarre. And how do I know it's possible bizarre? The Chsiv, it says in the pasuk, you wash off these evorim, and the hikr of hakoyin es hakoil victor mizbecha. Only a kohen is qualified to bring those evorim to the mizbeach. The Omar Mar zu holochas evorim lekevesh. You know what the pasuk is referring to when it says hikr v'kohen is hakoil victor mizbecha? It's referring to the avodah of carrying the evorim to the mizbeach. So you see clearly that even an avodah she'efsher levatla. Even in the avodah she'efsher levatla has to be done through a kohen. So halacha, even though it's efsher levatla, it should also have to be done through a kohen. Zok Gemara, hecha de gali vecha de loy gali. You know what? By halacha sevarim, these are meforshim pasuk that says the kohen has to do it. But by halacha sadam, where the Torah doesn't prefer shei kohen, therefore Reb Shimon, who holds that an avodah that's not absolutely necessary, maybe it does not have to be done through a kohen. Frank Gemara v'lav kol techenu, it should be a kavah chaymer. Uma halacha sevarim lekevesh. Madich carrying the evorim to the mizbeach. The loy ma'akva kapara. It was not ma'akev the kapara, because we already learned if you never ma'akev the evorim on the mizbeach, the person still got his kapara as long as the dam was spritzed. Nevertheless, boy kahuna halachas dam, bringing the dam to the mizbeach to spritz the ma'akev kapara. That's ma'akev the kapara. If you don't do zrika, you're not going to have a kapara from the carbon. Like kalshkin, surely it should have to be done by a kohen. So now the Gemara seems to come out to maskana that through this kavachaymer from halacha sevarim, the halacha of dam, even though the halacha is not always necessary, would have to be done by a kohen. So how did we start off this shaila? The shaila started was whether or not it could be done. So the Gemara said over here, Rabba Rabbi Yosef, Damri Tevayu, Holacha Bizarre is a Machloikas Reb Shimon v'Rabbanon. And now the Gemara is saying, no, even according to Reb Shimon, the Holacha would not be able to be done with a Zor, and we have a Kavul Chomer from Holacha Sevarim. Madach Holacha Sevarim, we're being maked on the Mizbeach, is not maked the Kapara. We have a Gzeres Akasav that says that only a Kohen could do it. Choshgein Holacha Sadam, even though Holacha doesn't have to be done, it would still have to be done dafka through a kohen. Gewaltig. Itmar nami Omar Ula Omar Rabbi Lazar Halacha Bizar Psula Afilu Reb Shimon. And in fact, that we have Ula telling us. So Rashi Afilu Reb Shimon. The Avlagav Dam Reb Shimon Loi Pasal Ba Machshava Mishum They net our carbon toliba. Even though Reb Shimon said that this halacha, which could only be done with a kohen, if the kohen had the wrong kavanah, it wouldn't possible it. because the carbon is not totally, the heter of the carbon is not totally halacha, because you could have avoided doing halacha. And therefore, v'loy karinin ba devarim hamavidim le'achila. We don't consider this devarim hamavidim le'achila. Aval avoida havel apostle bazar. It's still going to be an avoida that the apostle bazar does it, even though a machshava psula will not impact the halacha. Gebaltik iboilu. What about halacha shaloi berega? So that was the shaila that was brought up at the bottom of Yudala and Aleph. What if we had to transport to them, but it wasn't necessary for anyone to take a step? Somebody was able to pivot. He reached over to his right side and took the keli full of the dam, and then he moved it by his hand, by pivoting his body. He could have moved it even 6 feet, all the way over to the other side to pass it to the kohen who's standing near the mizbeach. So he did halacha, he moved the dam, he just didn't have to take a step to do so. So halacha shaloi beregel, shema halacha, is that considered halacha or lo shema halacha? What's the nafkamina if it's called halacha? So Rashi upas laba machshava l'rabbanon. If it's halacha according to the Rabbanon, who argues with the Shimon and who holds that halacha a machshava psula would cause a problem by the halacha, so that's shayla number one. Or you must hazar psula, or according to Shimon, we know halacha cannot be done with hazar. So what if the halacha was done without moving your feet? Is that considered the halacha that would be possible if a Yisrael did it? Or maybe that's not called the halacha at all, and therefore, if a Yisrael did it, it wouldn't cause a problem. It's looking more Toshma. Maybe we could bring a raya from a brisa that we just learned at the beginning of the Amid. What did the brisa tell us? That if you do halacha yoshev, v'chein yoshev, if any one of the avodas was done while the kohen was sitting, the avodah is possible. So v'chein yoshev, v'chein smoil, possible. If the kohen is mamish sitting down, he's possible. Now, when he's sitting down, he cannot take a step. So if someone's sitting down, how is he going to do the halacha? Obviously, by just taking it from one side and by bringing it to the other side. So dafka, if the kohen is sitting, dafka then will it cause a problem? But if the kohen was not sitting, if the kohen was standing, but dum yodiyoshev, so ha'omed dum yodiyoshev, meaning he's not moving, he just pivots his body and takes it from his left side and passes it to his right side, and vice versa. Masha would be kosher. It's only a problem because he was sitting down. But standing up and not moving is going to be kosher, meaning that's not considered an avodah. Zaktamar, no. Dilma Yoshev the Kashayif Meishev. And Oimid Duma the Yoshev denied Porta. Who said he's not moving when he's sitting down? He could be sitting down and he could, shuffle over while he's sitting. So it's Lav Dafka case where he's not moving. So too, the Oimid Duma the Yoshev means that he's moving his feet a little bit. So he is moving a little bit. So that's the halacha that would be kosher if he was oimid. It would be kosher if a kohen does it, but avada it is considered a halacha because he's moving it. So you don't have a right to our shaila of if he's not moving his feet at all, he's just reaching over with his hands. So Tashma, let's see if we can bring a raya from another source. Shachat Yisrael, the Yisrael shechted, the kibel hakoyin, and the kohen is makabel the dam. So far, everything's going textbook kosher. And then nosnoi lechaveroi. Then this is talking about. I think when they did the Korban Pesach, they had like a human chain, and they passed the dam from one kohen to the next until it reached the mizbeach. So shachat Yisrael, the kibel hakoyin nosnoi lechaveroi, v'chaveroi lechaveroi. So you see, you need to do a halacha, and the halacha. If the halacha is not going to be considered a good halacha, if no one moved their feet, then this wouldn't have been good. Making a human chain and passing the blood from one coin to the next until it reached the mizbeach, that wouldn't be kosher. Because here you need to do halacha. You got to get it over. And you're doing it in not the proper fashion because you're not moving your legs. But nevertheless, we see in the brisa that that's how they did the Korban Pesach. So it must be kosher, even though he's not moving his legs. It would be considered a halacha, even though he's not moving his legs. So Gemara Hasam Nami, the Naidi Porta. Maybe each kohen took a small step. They weren't stationary. They didn't keep their feet stationary. They could have moved over a little bit. Okay, Zog to Gemara Viter. Umay Kamash Malon. So if they're moving, what is the chiddush of this brisa? Bishlama, if the chiddush of the brisa is to tell you that even though they keep their legs stationary and they're just moving their arms, that's considered a kosher halacha. That's why the brisa would have taught me what they did there. But if that's not mutter, and you tell me they all took a little bit of a step, So then, what important pieces of information am I learning from this historical fact that they had a human chain? There's nothing halachic to be gained from this information. No, there is. But the Bride is teaching us that they wanted as many kohanim as possible involved in that krovas carbon pesach, because the more people involved, the greater heater it is, the greater covet it is for the carbon, and that's for the chiddush. So we still don't have a raya. Is it considered a holacha, even though someone didn't move their legs, they just passed it over with their arms? So the Gemara says, let's try another raya. Toshma, kivel hakosher. Someone who was kosher, a kohen kosher, was makabel the dam. V'nosan leposel, and he passed the dam to someone who's posel, and the apostle did holacha. Yachzir lekosher. He's got to give it back to the kosher, and they got to start over again. So you see very clearly that the holacha done through apostle would not be good. Zokt Rashi, Yachzir lekosher, shenos nuloi. The apostle has to give it back to the kohen who did the Kabbalah, who had originally given him the blood before he brought it closer to the Mizbeach. And we actually learn two halachas from this fact, that the apostle has to go back and give the dam to the kohen that gave it to him. The first chiddush you learn is not directly relevant to our shaila. That is chadar deloy misil b'mai de avsakei apostle. The fact that apostle got involved doesn't passel the carboning on him. We let him do a do-over. Normally you think, okay, apostle made the halacha, but the dam is not apostle. No. We actually allow you to roll back the tape and start over again. You can go back to where things went wrong and start over from there. That's chiddush number one. And chiddush number two is va'ashminin ba da'ilacha zu she'asa hakosher shaloi beregel shahoisid livsoil shahoisid l'apostle. This halacha that the kosher did, the kohen kosher handed it off to the apostle. Shoyomid betadam mizbeach loy nasis behechsher v'loy shmohilach. We also know that, okay, whatever the apostle did, maybe is not going to be valid. But the fact of the matter is, the kohen who was makabel the dam leaned over and passed the jug of blood to the apostle. Why wouldn't that be enough to fulfill the requirement of the halacha? Yet we see it's not. We say you got to give it back to the kohen who handed it to you and do a proper halacha. So you see, it says the katani yachsira and the it says that apostle has to go back and give the dam back to the kohen who gave it to him, and they got to do a new halacha. Why would they have to? Why can't we say the mere fact that the kohen kosher handed it off to the apostle, that could have been the halacha? Why pass it back to the original kohen? Let the apostle take it let the apostle continue holding on to it. And let a kosher come and take it off the hands of the apostle and then bring it to the mizbeach. The apostle won't stretch out his arm to pass it to him. He'll just hold it like he's a stand, like we learned earlier. It's the bottom of it. Why don't you let him do that? Elamai, it must be that it's not considered a proper halacha unless you walk with it. Zok Gemara, you don't have a raya, because who said it means yachzir l'kosher? Who said it means you got to go back and give it to the kohen who passed it to him? Maybe what the Brisa says, and you could change the girsa, yachzir hakosher v'yikabla. Maybe that's exactly what you do. It stays in the hands of the apostle, and then the kosher can take it off of his hands. And therefore, we'll say that the original halacha, when the original kohen passed it to the apostle, that was a good halacha, even though nobody took a step. And now, the apostle is holding it like a mere stand, and now another kohen is going to come from the mizbeach and take it off of his hands. So you see clearly that we don't necessarily have a raya from this price either way, whether or not it's a valid halacha, even though nobody took a step. So the Gemara has not been posted that shaila. So let's go back to Itmar. Amar Ulam Rabbi Yochanan, halacha shaloi beregel loy shmo halacha. Ula paskin in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, even though we couldn't bring a raya, but Ula paskin that it's not considered halacha. if it has to be moved, if the dam has to be moved from point A to point B, someone has to walk with it. You can't just stretch your arm over and pass it over. As Rashi Holacha, the Einok Sheira Loilichake. And therefore, if you had a machshava pigel by merely passing it over, it's not considered that a holacha was done. So when you transport it, it has to be done properly. Someone has to walk over with the blood to bring it to the kohen who's going to make this ritual. Okay, the Baltic. Zok tehelig gemar weiter. What happened if either bein she'asa zar or bein she'asa kayin? The Gimel says, so bein she'asa zar, bein she'asa kayin. So what did the Gimel say? The Amrit, we said, the Amrit, the Eina Holacha. We said it's not considered a Holacha if you just leaned over with it but didn't take a step. And therefore, upsula, and it's puzzle, the hanasa shaloi hilchos. So what happens if there was no proper halacha made? Rather, a kohen just reached over and took the jug of blood and stretched out his hand to another kohen standing by the mizbeach and passed it to him. So that was a puzzle halacha. There was no halacha done, because even though there was a kohen, it's still not a good halacha. So is that over, or can you redo it? Can you do a do-over? Or if it was done with a zar, with halacha did puzzle, again, can you do a do-over? So the question is, if a halacha was done improperly, does that pass a little carbon, or do we allow you to reverse the tape and pick up from where it was still kosher after the Kabbalah and redo the halacha? So miu yesh lo takana lachsira lachayev v'lach shalayich beregel or ein lam takana. So that was a shayla. Can you do a do-over? Zok Tilmar, Toshma. Maybe we could bring a raya from the brisa we just quoted a moment ago. Kibe la kosher, v'nasan l'apostle. A kohen kosher did a Kabbalah and he handed it off to apostle. Remember, we're saying there that he didn't walk with it. So yachzir la kosher. Now, if the apostle has it and he walked with it, all he has to do is pass it back to the kosher. So that from there we actually brought a raya that the halacha of the Zohar wasn't good. But the Gemara, if you remember, slugged up the raya, and the Gemara said maybe even if you're going to say like we when we wanted to neutralize the raya, we said maybe this apostle didn't do anything. One coin handed it off to him, and another coin is going to take it off of him. So therefore, there was never a halacha psula. So you don't even see that a do-over is necessary. But lemaisa yisol kadaitach lo efshel tekune ifsala. Lemaisa on the tzad that hayshatas leaning over and passing it, if that's considered an avoida, and if that's considered a good halacha, on that side, everybody agrees it would have to be done over. So yisol kadaitach lo efshel tekune ifsala. So then you see clearly that you're able to do it over, because at that point in the Gemara said that he'd have to go back to the original coin, give him the blood, and do it over again. So you see that the understanding was that you would be able to reverse the video and start back from the point of where things went wrong. Zot Gemara, no, you can't bring a right from it. Mi Savris, the Koi Zar Gavoy, you're assuming that what happened was the Kohen was 20 feet from the Mizbeach, and he passed it to the Zor. The Zor was 15 feet from the Mizbeach, and the Zor then passed it over to the other Kohen who was right at the Mizbeach. That's not necessarily what happened. Maybe the Kohen was 15 feet from the Mizbeach, and the Zor was even further away from the Mizbeach. And maybe the Kohen was passing it to the Zor in the opposite direction. So that surely wouldn't be considered a halacha that was done through a Zor, because halacha means you're getting closer to the Mizbeach. If you're going further away from the Mizbeach, there was no halacha done at all. So Zokmar Misav is the Koi Zar Gavoy. Who said that Bryce is speaking where the Zor is closer, and his action is bringing the blood closer to the Mizbeach, and it's considered a halacha? Boy, the Koi Zar Baroi, the Zor was further away. So there was no halacha done at all. So we don't have to reverse anything and do over. We never did halacha. We're still at the point where we're post Kabbalah, and there's a apostle holding it, but he hasn't done anything. There avada you could do. So you don't have a raya that you could do a do-over once something was done possible, because maybe that bride is speaking where nothing was done yet. Okay? Baruch Hashem, we were zeichen to finish up Yudalad, and tomorrow, Baruch Hashem, we will